Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Transition Planning, How to Avoid the Black Hole Between Graduation and Adulthood. My name is Natalie Roth and I'm the Director of Marketing for Excelify. If you're not familiar with us, Excelify is a leading provider of special ed management systems. We're committed to supporting school districts and special ed staff in fulfilling the promises made by IDEA to students with disabilities by streamlining every step of the special ed process from referral and intake to IEP development, service tracking, and Medicaid billing. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to explain a couple of technical items for today's webinar. During the webinar, you can hear us, but we cannot hear you. So if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box on your control panel. I'll do my best to answer questions throughout by chatting back to you, and then field as many questions to our host as we have time for at the end of the session. A recording of the webinar and the webinar slides will be made available to those who complete a short survey following the webinar. And last but not least, if you are on social media, so are we. You can follow us on social to find out about future webinars, events, news, and contests, and you can tweet about today's webinar using the hashtag SpedChatWeb. Without further ado, I'd like to now introduce today's presenter, Jennifer Kaut. She is the State Autism and Developmental Disorders Specialist for Texas Workforce Solutions Vocational Rehabilitation Services, where she provides staff consultation and training and collaborates with stakeholders, including employers, school districts, public universities, legislative staff, and other state agencies. Jennifer published the first Texas Department of Assistive and Rehabilitative Services State Policy and Applied Behavior Analysis, and she's also published 4 additional state policies that created the first ever autism endorsement for employment specialists and an autism premium and vocational assessment for developmental disorders. In addition to working with the state of Texas, Jennifer is the founder and executive director of Inspire Behavior Therapy, which employs board-certified behavior analysts to provide treatment for children and adults with developmental disorders. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Jennifer so we can begin today's presentation. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. So what is transition? It should be a seamless bridge that takes a student from high school to their desired post-secondary options, such as college, a training program, or employment. But all too often, this bridge becomes broken. I'm sure many of you have seen this. When students are in school, they're protected by that bubble of special education services. Although the ART is a team that includes parents and students, the school really does drive that process and provides that safety net that they're very used to. When transition from the safety net is just not carefully and thoroughly planned, that bridge from school to post-secondary options can start to crumble. I see that all the time, and it's very scary for parents. And when their students are about to graduate, they can panic. Say, oh my gosh, what's next? Now what do I do, right? So if that bridge and transition does crumble, these students can fall into the black hole we're talking about. And research will show you over and over again that these students will be the least successful and will most likely fall into what is become known as the black hole, right? And these students don't transition, they remain stuck in between that high school and post-secondary options. The age group most likely to be caught in that black hole are students 18 to 24. I know for the agency VR that I work for, and I'll explain more what that is our most, the ages that we get the most referrals from is that age group. And lately we've been really getting a lot of 23, 24, 25-year-olds that are still at home. Most people, the ones that are home, are autism. They're not successful in group homes. Parents don't know really what to do with them. They're tired. They haven't had, these kids who are older, they haven't had the intervention they should have had, and they're stuck. And they really don't have that direction nor the skills to become independent. Also, if, they didn't bridge over and they're at home, I get calls all the time. Many of them are sitting there playing video games. Parents are paying for all of their bills, and they're not having to do budgets, they're not having to do a whole lot responsible, then they're having a hard time being independent, and I don't know what's motivating them to work or to go to college. I see that all the time. Sometimes I'll ask these parents, and I'll say, well, okay, your kid's really intelligent, and that's great. Do they know how to do their laundry? Do they know how to cook a meal? Can they grocery shop? Do they have a debit card? And the answer is typically no. So, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't click to that. Who is at risk? Students with neurotypical disorders, and we define in Texas a neurological disorder is learning disorders, ADHD, autism, and IDD. But who's the most at risk? And this is students with autism spectrum disorder. I'm sure that's not a shock. That's definitely the population that most people struggle with the most. So let's talk about students with autism. 40% of those with autism that do attempt college, less than half will not complete them, which is really shocking. It's shocking and it's not. I know in Texas, universities are realizing that these kids are not being successful, and they're starting to provide some wraparound services, especially for autism. Give an example, Texas Tech University has created a program called Project CASE, and the kids have to get in regularly, but they support them with through social skills supports, getting to the professors, getting into classes. If they have an anxiety about something that happened in class, they will deal with it. If they like a girl, but they appear to be stalking this girl, they can deal with it versus them getting kicked out. There's lots of examples of that, and I know a lot of your universities around Texas are going to duplicate that, that service. So only 55% of these young adults with autism held paying jobs during their first 6 years out of high school. That's a lot of time. The lowest percentage among that disability categories examined, the lowest by all of them. 9 out of 10 with autism are either unemployed or underemployed. And this is regardless of their IQ or education level. In fact, the students have been educated in the, inclusive educational setting are able to exceed academics. They're often the least successful after graduation. So these are the kids that, graduating with, honors exceptional. They haven't had, resource, or they're not life skills, but they have that academic ability. So due to their focus on the academia, these students almost never receive vocational services, nor any kind of social skill training or behavioral intervention. Therefore, they're the least prepared to navigate their social world. I mean, I've provided in my, I'm actually a board-certified behavior analyst. I've been in the field for 24 years. And so I still have a clinic, as Natalie said, and I still do private practice as well as my agency role. I enjoy working with the adults and the teens, and I see this issue. The ones that are coming to me are the ones that had no problem with academics, and now they're having major issues in college or getting employment. I've conducted countless of consultations for the 20-something-year-olds who might have a degree, even several degrees, but they've never worked. I talked to a guy who's 24, has 2 degrees, really, really intelligent. Never worked, doesn't know how to do laundry, doesn't care to do laundry, and expects that he gets his career job as soon as he graduated. And he doesn't understand why he doesn't have one. But he told his professors, lots of his professors, how much of an idiot they are and how much smarter he was than them. Now, given he probably was, but obviously he didn't have the social skills to know that that wasn't, to have a filter and know that wasn't okay. And again, once they do obtain employment, they're just the most likely to be fired for their lack of social skills. And frankly, they're hardest one to deal with for VR because they can be the most rigid because they're aware of so many things. They have phobias, obsessive compulsive disorders, or just obsessive thoughts and perseverations. They have a lot of cognitive inflexibility, and if that hasn't been worked on throughout their childhood and teen years, once they get in their 20s, that's really, really hard to undo. So successful transition starts with a roadmap. It just has to. Successful transition is a purposely driven with clear and concise objectives. It contains a specific, detailed roadmap that should be established by 9th grade. Now, given the caveat, transition should start when the disability is identified. But for the purposes of this webinar, we will focus on transitioning from high school. The transition goal that's involved and is recorded in the ARD, it is not a suffice roadmap, nor is it typically accurate. Many times it's very broad, or it's an out-of-reach employment goal. And many times the teachers and parents have a really hard time being very honest with these kiddos. And I know they're not trying. I'm not saying to break them down or not give them hope, but you can start with something that they want, let's say ninth grade, and that might be, out of reach, and then slowly start having them understand what's really obtainable. So step one, there's really two steps, two major steps for successful transition. In step one, you have to create a baseline of the student's strengths and deficits. It must be determined. But in order to obtain this baseline, a thorough transition assessment should be conducted. And I work with districts all over Texas. We have a lot. We have about, I think it's 150 high schools. I work with 600 vocational rehabilitation counselors. And very rarely do I see these school districts do a transition assessment. It is all based on their opinions, their experience, and without being a non-biased, objective assessment. So here's an example of a resource in Texas that you guys can definitely access. Across Texas, the state, we have educational service centers, and each center is tasked with a specialization. This center is a state lead for transition. We also have, we have one that is a state lead for autism. This one's transition. The website that you're looking at contains just about everything you need to know about transition from high school. It also gives recommendations for employment. One of their most useful resources is the extensive, and I mean extensive, it can be overwhelming, I'll be honest, online library of transition assessments that can be accessed by anyone. As Natalie said, you'll be receiving an electronic copy of this presentation, so you're going to be able to access this website and obtain these resources. I really hope this is beneficial to you. I know that it's been beneficial to me. I go in there every once in a while, and I feel like I need a different assessment that will match a kiddo better. These they just have, in every category, they have them available, so I hope you do resource. You use this resource. Okay, so step number 2. You have to have a working roadmap. And it's just that roadmap has to be established per the results of that transition assessment. The roadmap also is adjusted year by year as progress is made or new deficits are discovered. A roadmap has to be a living, breathing document, as an IEP should. But we all know sometimes that's not. Goals that last a year, sometimes they master them, but we don't go in and actually change those goals. As we don't sometimes the transition goal. It is just so vital that the transition assessments are conducted every year, and I do mean every year. 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade, their graduation ARD, even if they go to 18+ services, it has to be done every year. And there are sometimes that there is different assessments. Sometimes their ability to do their own, maybe the parent has to fill out the first couple years, but then they start to have the ability, which I highly recommend, to fill those assessments out themselves. That's the most important. Where do they see themselves? How are they aware? Do they have self-advocacy? Are they aware of some of their deficits? Do they know their weaknesses? Do they have self-determination? Do they know where they want to go? All of these things are really important, and many of them can come out in transition assessment. Also, how many of us really know what jobs are available? And so these assessments can look at the skills they have, can take their academia and their abilities, and really titrate it down to jobs that they may have never known existed. I'm going to talk about an example, and I'm going to use my son. I have a son with autism. He's 22 years old. He's kind of in the middle of that the spectrum. And when we were looking for his career job, and I'll talk about that later, I had really no idea, even myself with all my resources, what would be the best fit for him. And we used assessments to find out where he was. Engineering was one of his main interests, but that wasn't going to work. That was something that he was not going to obtain. And going through engineering, we were able to just titrate it all the way down with the same kind of hands-on experience and interest down to a mail clerk, which I would have never guessed would be a really great fit for him. I'll talk more about him in just a little bit. Okay, so let's talk about Kevin. Here's an example of a roadmap for autism. So in ninth grade, we identified several deficiencies, but these are the ones that we really felt we have to deal with, we have to tend to right now. So we identified his severe generalized anxiety. I mean, he had anxiety across the board. Before he went into school, he would have a major panic attack, threaten to break limbs, if we made him go to school, required that we had to tour him around all the classes before he would attend. It probably took me a week of every day going to school before school started to help him get acquainted, and he wanted to memorize the maps of school. His anxiety was really, really severe, and really that comes along. It's not, uncommon for these guys who, when you hit that puberty level, their anxiety can just be twofold. The cognitive inflexibility that I talked about prior, that also was really, really rigid. He just didn't have the ability to see more than one way to problem solve, which obviously can be a detriment to you in school. He also had the inability to engage people. He didn't want to look at them. He didn't want to talk to them. He had his head down. He didn't have any friends at all. Thought that anybody he said hi to was his friend. He just really didn't like engaging with people. He was also very addicted to video games at home. I had to yank him out of his room and make him come down, and if you heard the garage door, he had to greet me there, and he had to say hi, and he had to tell me a couple things he did at school. And he definitely did that. He came in, he said, hi, I did fine. I had to head into math class and walk back upstairs. So that was something we had to work on. To address these, though, Kevin started to work in ninth grade. He got work experience in the school setting. We started in there, kind of a safety net, as an assistant to the school computer technician. And so he would be going in and helping him set up computers, and then he would deliver paper, although he would deliver paper with his head down, and he would slam it on the desk and basically run out of the classroom. So it took a lot. It took us the whole year to really, start getting progress on that. So in 10th grade, we did see progress with his overall anxiety. That was a wonderful thing to see, and in 1 year there was a lot of progress. But it was in the school setting, and it just hadn't generalized to other settings, other environments. So to address this, we decided to do work experiences in a lot of different environments. And I'm talking not the same kind of environments, churches, grocery stores, landscaping places, like all different ones to see how he was. And one of them was a daycare center, which when they told me he was going to go to daycare center, I was like, oh my God, I don't know how that was going to work. I can't imagine him, doing well with that. He was reading books to little ones. They were very young. He made me crack up, because after that work experience, he came home and he's like, I don't like children. I definitely will never work with children. Hey, which is really good to know, right? So in addition to those various work experiences in 10th grade, we required Kevin to attend typical high school events and like football games, right? He had no interest in that, and dances, which people may think I'm crazy to make him go to a dance. But he needed to be pushed, and all of our guys, when we made that roadmap, we have to make them look at what is appropriate and push them through it. I always say as a parent, you got to push them. You just don't push them off the cliff, but you got to get right to that point. And it's hard work as a parent to do that. So let's move over. 11th grade. He didn't have any ability to self-advocate. He was looking at teachers to help him, access resources, access, modifications, and say when he didn't know something, raise his hand, ask questions, any of that kind of thing. He didn't have the ability to identify his own strengths and weaknesses, and that's so important. I don't focus on weakness. Everybody has weaknesses. everybody has strengths, and he just couldn't identify both, which is extremely important when you're going to employment, right? Because looking at employment, and in college, what are your strengths and your learning styles? What are your strengths when you go to employ it? Can you tell an employer what you're good at? I'm really good at this. I'm struggling, but I'm learning, and I'm willing to learn, with this issue. So in 11th grade, we really had to work on that cognitive inflexibility. He still was really tough, really tough on that. And again, like I said, that's a really tough one. That's one of the hardest ones. And they're rigid. They like, they don't transition. They don't like things to change, right? And so that was difficult. Also, cognitive flexibility, that is increased twofold when you have anxiety. And again, in high school, every kid is having trouble, fitting in and all those, things that go on with high school. So you can imagine, autism, they really struggle. We're still working on social anxiety. And understand all of these things are identified because we use transition assessment. There are so many. I'm not going to give you one example because you're going to find tons. Your school district, if you work for a school district, might have their ones that they like and they use. So what we did to address these issues that we identified in 11th grade, these were the ones we had to work on. That was the one that was most important. Again, every year we looked at what did he need for that year. We didn't try to tackle everything one year. We used the roadmap. We were very specific. All the IEP goals reflected this. And everybody on his team knew we were working on this. So it was a team effort. I worked on it as a parent. School worked on it too. So what we did to address this was we increased those outside community work experiences. We went from a couple hours per week to 4 to 6 week rotations. And so that was a big jump and had a lot of effect on him. Really positive effect. Okay, so moving on to 12th grade. Peer social engagement was an issue. Being literal was an issue, obviously throughout his life, He would ask me, what am I going to have for dinner? And I'd say, I don't know. I think we're going to have liver and, and raw, sushi. And he would freak out and go, oh my God, no way. And I'd say, what's Mom doing? Oh, you're teasing me. He was really upset and didn't have a sense of humor. But as we worked through all that literism and got him to have a sense of humor and lighten up. It's also really important when you're going to work. You can't be literal. You're not going to be able to problem solve and fit in and know when somebody's teasing you, when to take something literally. It's an important skill. And because he was transitioning, to more work environment, that was something we had to work on. I'm going to give you an example of literism. So if he had a walkie-talkie at one of his jobs, and it was sent to him, and if somebody asked a customer, or a coworker would ask him something that he didn't know the answer to, he just wouldn't answer. He'd just walk away. So he's being very literal. If I don't know the answer, then I can't give you it, right? His work stamina needed to be, we needed to look at that because he was only working a couple hours and he didn't want to or have the motivation or direction to increase that. At that time, in the beginning of school year, again, that's what the roadmap, the assessment pointed at. But 12th grade was a huge year, lots of change, right? And developmental disorders, it's like they kind of stagnate for a while and then they shoot up. And you suddenly see, this big progress because that takes a lot of repetition to increase their skills. A lot of people say, oh, they matured. Well, no, they didn't mature. That's part of it, but it's because of the intervention. It's because of the repetition. So in the fall, in his 12th grade year, he obtained his first paid employment at Michael's because he organized the ribbon, the ribbon aisle better than anybody, any employee had. The manager wanted him to work right away. And it was a volunteership that ended up into paid employment. So he started working 5 to 6 hours a week. He had to have intensive job coaching support, and he was in a vocational program at school. And the transition assessments, they show that Kevin had a lot of abilities, but, where he was in the spectrum, college was just not in his best interest. A month after graduating, Kevin obtained a job at Home Depot, which was the last place I thought he had ever worked. He did not like to lift things, and he didn't like heat. But he liked the smell of wood. So, hey. He started working 10 to 12 hours per week. And so then at his graduation, the transition assessment showed that, Kevin had a lot of skills for his developmental stage. He needed to work. He just gotten that job at Home Depot. He needed to obtain life skills that could be addressed at home. And within a year of working at Home Depot, Kevin was up to 26 to 29 hours a week, which was phenomenal. And really, we thought he would go to post, 18-plus services, and they were planned after graduation. But after the assessment, again, at that, graduation art, there's no reason for it. We couldn't justify it. So then, post-graduation, Kevin worked at Home Depot for 3 years. During those 3 years, Kevin became so much more social. Like, I can't even tell you how much more. It was like therapy, and I'm a behavior analyst, but I had to say it was probably the most effective therapy he could have. He started enjoying engaging with all sorts of people, and so much so he earned a customer service award for 2 years, and this is the kid who walked away when he didn't know an answer. But, as a proud mom, I want to just say 2 months ago, at 22 years of age, he obtained his first full-time job as a mail clerk, like I kind of gave you a tidbit just a little while ago, for the Texas Workforce Commission. He works downtown. He drives to a bus station and takes a bus to downtown, and that's a huge step for Kevin. So let's talk about vocational rehabilitation, or VR. I'm going to call it VR for short. So it's a federal program. It is available in all states. It can be accessed if the student's disability is a barrier to post-secondary options. So again, students who have a disability that is a barrier from being successful in those post-secondary options, such as college or obtaining employment, they may be eligible to receive VR services. However, though, later in the presentation, you'll learn how VR no longer has to wait until a student is transitioning to post-secondary. Services can be started before they graduate, which was not available before a federal regulation came into play, and I'll explain more in a minute. Anybody can apply for VR services if you have a disability. But before eligibility, it's an eligibility service in all states. Before eligibility is determined, a certified rehabilitation counselor will have to assess the student to determine if a barrier truly exists. And just because a student has a disability, that doesn't mean it creates a barrier. You could have ADHD and be perfectly fine in college or in your job. So state by state, VR is housed in varying agencies. Like in Texas, in September of this year, we were moved to the Texas Workforce Commission, which makes sense. We have more access to businesses and connections in that way. In Texas, we serve over 80,000 clients with all varying disabilities. Although the developmental disorders, they're now our largest population that we serve, approximately 32,000 clients. Autism, though, is our fastest growing population that we serve, and it just recently is larger than our ADHD or IDD population, which was not before. We have 3 times the amount of autism coming to us in the next 5 years from the school districts. So historically, though, and I don't know how it is in your state and where you are, but during the graduation, our students and parents were just handed a brochure, and they were told, hey, this is an agency you can access, and just given no really details, nor was there any collaboration between the school and the agency. So this obviously contributed to that black hole. Now, like, where's that bridge? It just wasn't there. So I'm just going to share with you some specialized services for developmental disorders. These are really new, extremely new. Most of the policies came out this year. So let me give you some examples. 5 years ago, though, I started with VR, and I was hired as a clinician to do more of a clinical assessment for the needs of our neurodevelopmental population. And state leaders identified that VR was not serving them well. They knew that. The successful rates were really low, and they wanted to address this deficit. It took me a year to understand that VR system. Even as a teacher who taught all autism, I had no idea what VR was. I mean, it was very new to me because they didn't take my kids. They took, learning disabilities and kind of the upper tier, but they didn't come get my kids. And I worked in a high school. So I had to understand the process, and I had to thoroughly assess these populations' needs for VR. And so I established these specialized services. So one of the things, of course, being the board certified behavior analyst, I knew that the treatment, we had to bring in applied behavior analysis. And the only treatment that we had available for VR was psychological services. And as you know, developmental disorders, they don't respond very well to psychological services. We also, the only assessment we had was just an enforced psychological, and that didn't work when they would go into a new environment, new place, and the psychologist would judge them on their behavior. And a lot of times it was just the developmental disorder or the autism, especially autism, that would just come out and they would say they're not eligible for services. So that didn't work. So the second thing I did was develop a statewide team of specially trained VR counselors. That is so important. Many of my counselors didn't even have the basics of autism, and I know this is an issue throughout the United States. I talk to the leaders in every state, and that's the main issue. The next thing, though, is the autism endorsement I created that employment specialists can earn through the University of North Texas. So employment specialists, and this is typically the same in all states, VR counselors. They are counselors, many more LPCs, and they all have a master's degree in vocational rehabilitation. But many of these counselors have caseloads. Some of them have caseloads of 175 clients. I mean, it's just impossible for them to go out and develop these employment opportunities. So most of VR services contract out with employment specialists, and they have to go through a really intensive credentialing process. And so the autism endorsement is the first endorsement for these credentials. They have to go through support employment. It takes them at least about 4 to 6 months to get their credentials. Then on top of the employment, the autism endorsement, they take 6 courses and work, social skills, how to teach social skills, behavior reduction. They're trained on a specialized assessment that I created. They have a lot of background that will, help them be specialists. They also have a degree to take on more developmental disorders and autism. So here's some more examples. Money is a motivator for everybody, right? Autism can take longer. It can be the harder disability. So can, other developmental disorders, but the feedback I got was autism was the one they just didn't know how to work with. They didn't feel successful. So you got a reward. Now you got to pay. If you want a specialist to work with these, you got to pay. So I created an endorsement. The endorsement can help them receive a premium, and it is really good money. They have all gotten good feedback for it. It's worth it, though. We get these kids early intervention, and they don't come back. They may not, have SSI. They may not have to be in the waiver program. It is a good investment for the state of Texas. And we, not just transition, we're obviously talking about transition today, but it's available. These people work with all ages. Although, again, we have 80% of our clients are 18 to 24. So then we created a new assessment that will identify variables that affect the client's ability to function at, his potential, should be his or her potential. So I'm going to give you a little more details about that. So, and I can send Natalie an example of that assessment because it is public property. It's on, internet, and if you're interested, you can use this as a tool. It's really more of a social skill assessment, tested in a variety of environments to see how their skills either increase or decrease. It has domains like self-regulation, emotional intelligence, basic social skills, and communication skills. It's 40 basic skills that identify that you have to have in order to be successful in college or employment, but you need to address it in high school. So as you know, many students with and adults with the developmental disorders have varying levels of abilities that they are dependent on those environment variables, such as a slow versus a fast work pace, loud versus quiet surroundings, outdoors versus indoors. I know I can't go to a grocery store, at noon on Saturday. I'm going to forget, half my grocery list and get overwhelmed. And so it's called the Environmental Work Assessment, and it focuses on the student's responses to those variables in a potential work environment rather than how they perform the job. stability. They can easily learn those job tasks, but it's how they respond. The results of the assessment will identify variables that affect this consumer stability, like we talked about, and when determining the most appropriate work environment, you've got to consider those environmental conditions. And some of those are like, for example, like I said, work pace, but it's like odors in there. It is, because some people, I love Bed Bath & Beyond. It smells awesome, but I've had clients who go in and can't walk in. It's too overwhelming. Or really loud sounds, or somewhere where unexpected sounds come in, like a baby crying or an alarm going off. And they can't handle it, and they may have an acting out behavior. Also, the temperature of a place, the social interaction that's required. Are they required, to work with 1 or 2 people, or are they at a grocery store and they have 30 people in an hour to interact with? It's really important. And I'm going to give an example. So, let's say a loud, busy environment reduces the client's ability to follow those directions, or whether a job outdoors that requires that heavy lifting, that sensory piece, improves the client's ability to focus. You have to look at those. Again, it's really important to know, is it bringing out the disability, or is it increasing their ability? And you need to look at the increased ability. I've been brought in, I can't tell you how many consultations, and that we put a client in a horrible environment, but we're going to try to fix it. I'm not real big on math and numbers, and you can make me an accountant, but I'm going to need a lot of support. So why not, obviously look at my strengths. So WIOA makes transition a priority. So let me explain what this is. So it stands for Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And I was so excited to see this out. Everybody knows transition is important, but it validated it and made it a requirement. So this is phenomenal. It's a huge development. So these new federal regulations contained in WIOA require that all VR, so it's federal, all VR programs spend at least 15% of their federal dollars on pre-employment services. It means they don't have to just, typically we had to end an employment, but they don't have to be getting employment. This is before, they're ready to go to college. It's while they're in high school. And it's for students ages 10 to 22 have a disability. For Texas, this is millions and millions of dollars that we have to spend. I know right now it's new and we're having trouble spending the money. And so I'm sure in the next few years it's going to get easier, but that's phenomenal. It also establishes, like I told you before, transition as a priority. When before accessing students while in school, they were not a priority. And we had transition counselors, but they didn't get in the schools, and typically they had so many schools and they had a huge caseload. They were kind of skimming the water with that, and now it is a priority, which is obviously just a phenomenal opportunity. So again, it provides employee employment services, and those are opportunities that just hadn't existed before. Example, summer work experiences, a summer job. We couldn't get a job. It's only lasted 2 months before. Now we can. Again, it provides much needed collaboration between schools and VR, that bridge that was not there, that, handing off of the brochure. Well, we can't duplicate school services. We can fill those gaps where the schools cannot. So an example, in Texas, we can provide in-home support if hygiene is an issue or parents need support. We can pay for driving lessons. That's really essential, especially in Texas where there's a lot of rural areas. Treatments such as applied behavior analysis and helping to get their first job. Research has shown that students who obtain their first job before they graduate, they're 3 times as likely to succeed after graduation. I've done many pilots, and getting them looking at, from 9th grade, 10th grade, and really making sure that those deficits are taken care of by the junior year. The senior year, even 18 plus too, but the senior year, getting them that, first job is just all the difference. I give the example of Kevin. He would never be where he's at if he did not obtain his first job. That really progressed, that really helped him, grow up faster and be more independent. This is really the end of my presentation. I'm hoping you guys have some questions. A lot of this is new. It's very passionate, for me. I started this, in VR when Kevin was 16. I've been doing this 24 years, but transition and vocational rehabilitation with autism and developmental disorders is still so new. Even I, going through transition, I learned so much, and really everything that I went through as a parent has driven these policies and procedures and assessments, for the state. And I am proud to say Texas is ahead of those things, which is really cool. But there is so much more that we need to develop. There's just there's a real gap. And also because I would say Texas is a country, it's just huge, and every need is different. From Lubbock to Austin to Dallas, we have lots. Dallas in that central part of Texas got so much more providers, but you're looking at the rural areas, they don't have anybody, and they certainly don't have any specializations. So it's exciting to see the new developments, but we're still very new, and best practices, still being discovered, and a lot of research is. But in the end, transition from school to post-secondary options is essential. A thorough roadmap has to be established. It has to be followed through, and you have to use objective, measurable assessments to really drive that. So that's the end of my presentation. If we have questions, I'm sure Natalie will take it over.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. Your presentation was excellent. We do have a few questions that came in. The first one was if you could please repeat the name of the Texas Tech program that you referenced at the beginning of the presentation.
Sure, and I am one of their biggest fans. They have actually a multi-million-dollar autism treatment program called the Burkhart Center on the Texas Tech campus. It is wonderful and has many programs. One of the programs that they have that's involved, they treat babies to the kids in college and adults. One of the programs they have is called Project Case. And again, it provides that wraparound support. They do a thorough assessment on what's needed. They typically everything is individual to the person, and they have kept so many kids from being kicked out of school for various reasons. They also help them get an internship, and they see them all the way through, college and getting the employment. So it's a really good model. I know many of the state universities are trying them out. We have several, one in San Antonio, one in Houston, that are establishing them. We have one in the Valley by Howard Gym that it's a community college who's doing the same thing. They call them learning coaches.
Great, thank you. Another question came in regarding transition plans. You said that they should be established from 9th grade. Do you know if that is required in all states?
Well, in Texas, it's required by at least 14. But again, typically, they're not roadmaps. They're very general. You ask them, what do you want to do for a living? What do you want to do when you grow up, right? And typically, they're not real practical. Kevin wanted to produce video games. So, and how many of these kids want to be video game designers? So, yeah, 14, and it really should. Again, like I said, disabilities. As soon as you have a disability, you're planning for a transition. But it is very by state to state.
Okay. And what does a transition assessment look like? I know you mentioned there are lots of different assessments out there. What are some of the components that you would typically see in a transition assessment?
Sure. So there are several, and it depends on what you are assessing. One of them that I know of, it's called the decision-making matrix, and I would have no problem, Natalie, sending that forward so people can look at that. That's just one, in Austin we happen to use, and that looks at lifelong learning abilities, adults, living skills. It looks at your social, recreation, and leisure skills. Do you have any? And it looks at your level of independence. Do you just participate in life and everybody's kind of dragging you around, or are you independent? And you can look at each year, and the parent are going to do the evaluation, teacher's going to be involved, and the student, if they have the ability, they'll be involved. And it's really interesting to see where the student ranks themselves. It's important to know what their perception of their abilities is. Where the parents are, typically the parents are either they overestimate their kids' ability, or they really underestimate, and then sometimes the teachers can do the same. So that's one, and I'd be happy to send that to you. Another one is, and this is the one that I think we use the most, is because social skills is the #1 deficit that we're going to see in, at least in autism. ADHD actually has almost just as many social skill deficits that typically will fly under the radar as autism. I know my clinic, I treat both. Those are my largest developmental sort of populations. And so that the environmental work assessment is the one that I briefly described, that looks at specific skills that you need to target. And that's got to be, that's what's the key about it, is not broad, but like specific ones, like, for example, when given feedback, by, somebody of authority, they can take the feedback with very little reaction to it, and modify their behavior. That's a huge important skill, right? I'll be happy to send that, to you. When we work in the schools, it becomes your IEP objective, very specific IEP objectives.
Excellent. And then this last question is, how involved are parents in transition planning? Or how involved should parents be in transition planning?
They should be fully on, hands-on, all deck, and involved. The problem is, though, when I see a lot of parents, is that they can be very intimidating. I mean, you're around at least, 7 or 8 professionals, and they're telling you what their opinion is, or they're brushing off transition and not really making it a huge priority, or just focusing on the high school and what's happening year by year. And so parents really have to step up, and they have to advocate, and they have to go, where are we going? How is a 3rd math, or a 3rd English going to help my kid? Sometimes they're, or they're not looking at academia, and they go immediately to life skills, and they're only working on, the basics, and not looking at some of the, academia or the vocational part of it, or they let them just wash tables. When they can get out in the community, they can expose them to more. So parents really have to advocate, and they have to partner with the schools. And a lot of times the schools will say, we don't have a transition program. Well, in Texas, there is a law that came out that somebody in that district has to be identified as a transition specialist or coordinator. They have to look at those needs. And that doesn't mean that they end up creating those programs, but they have to have somebody identified. I can't tell you how many districts I have come across that say, sorry, I'm graduating you because we don't have a transition program. We're 18+ program, and that is not acceptable, and they can get in a lot of trouble for that. Doesn't mean they all get caught. But the good thing is that VR is now able to supplement maybe those rural areas who can't create one or don't know how to.
Right. We have, if we have time for one more question, this one is regarding your experience with Kevin. How much of Kevin's high school program was integrated into mainstream classes, and how much was he receiving direct and explicit instruction from special educators and other service providers?
Good question. So Kevin, being in the middle of the spectrum, he was everything was accommodated. Modified for him. Some of his other classes were, he had inclusion, but those basic classes like reading, math, his core academia, were modified, and they were in a special education week sports classroom. And if he was in like history, he did take history and science classes, it still was modified for him. I had an excellent team, I have to admit. I was in a really good school district who worked with me, listened to me, listened to my experience, collaborated, and that made all the difference, because it wasn't just me supporting them at home. I had a whole team of wraparound services through the school that really made a difference for Kevin. I'm very grateful for what they did and how they supported, Kevin and our whole family.